Hello, glad to see you on the channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and don't forget to write a comment. Enjoy watching.
My mother always had a way of controlling a room without raising her voice. She'd walk in and you'd feel it. The drop in temperature, the shift in air pressure, like something just snapped into place, and you better not breathe wrong. People admired her, respected her, feared her even. She was the kind of woman who wore white cashmere in summer and never spilled on it. Who could serve you a backhanded compliment with such grace you'd thank her for it? And she ran our family like a corporate board, with a clear hierarchy, a performance review every Thanksgiving, and an unspoken clause that made her love conditional. I was never fired, but I was never promoted either. Just tolerated. It started early. Zach, my younger brother by 3 years, was born with a smile that made teachers forget he hadn't done his homework. Mom used to say he had charm you can't teach, and maybe she was right. He got away with everything. When he was 5 and flushed my gold earrings down the toilet, she laughed and said boys are naturally curious. When I was 8 and spilled grape juice on the rug, she made me scrub the stain while telling me about the sacrifices she'd made so we could live in a respectable home. That word, respectable, it hung over our house like a chandelier, sparkly, heavy, ready to fall. As far back as I can remember, my role was simple: don't embarrass her. If I got straight A's, she asked why I didn't join more clubs. If I joined clubs, she wondered why I couldn't lose a few pounds like Madison's daughter down the street. My birthday parties were tasteful, efficient, and over by 7. Zach's were wild, loud, and ran until the neighbors complained. And even then, she defended him. Boys need to blow off steam, she'd say, pouring wine and winking at her friends. I learned early that praise was a currency she reserved for him. He could forget her birthday and get a hug. I once wrote her a 2-page handwritten card for Mother's Day, and she told me the handwriting could use work. And don't make it about you, she added. That stuck with me. Don't make it about you. It became my internal voice, my silent mantra. Sit quietly, let Zach shine. Let Mom have her narrative. Still, I wasn't a rebel. I wasn't one of those girls who screamed or slammed doors or dyed her hair purple. I just worked harder. I read books. I volunteered. I became the kind of daughter any normal parent might be proud of. But not Diane. She saw effort as a kind of weakness. If it doesn't come naturally, maybe it's not meant to be, she used to say. To me, never to Zach. He could fail out of community college twice, and she'd frame it as finding his path. I got into a top university, early admission, and she barely looked up from her phone. Is that the one with the ugly mascot? She asked. The thing is, I applied without telling her. I didn't ask for her help, her money, her approval. I researched scholarships, applied for grants, even worked part-time at a bookstore junior year, just to feel like I had something of my own. When the acceptance letter came, I stood in the hallway outside her room, clutching it like a secret. I remember the feeling, like I'd grown a second spine, something she hadn't built. I knocked. She didn't look up. What now? She asked in that tone that already assumed I'd done something wrong. I got into Emerson, I said, voice trembling, but steady enough to hear. Silence. On scholarship, I added, as if that might sweeten the blow. She finally looked up. That's in Boston, she said slowly, like I'd told her I was moving to Siberia. Yeah. And you didn't think to discuss this with me before applying? I opened my mouth, closed it, then said, I didn't want you to feel obligated. She smiled, not a warm smile, the kind you give someone right before you pull the rug. Sweetheart, I always knew you'd do something impulsive like this. But let me be clear, if you go, you're on your own. No tuition help, no rent, no safety net. It was supposed to be a threat, but it landed like a dare, and maybe that was the moment. The exact moment I stopped being her daughter and became her disappointment. I didn't cry, I didn't fight, I packed, I left. I worked double shifts, shared a basement apartment with 2 roommates and a family of mice, and I survived. Barely, but I did. Zach, meanwhile, stayed home, crashed cars, dated waitresses who left crying, started a landscaping business that lasted 3 weeks, then lived off Mom's credit cards like it was his birthright. And she let him. Praised his entrepreneurial spirit. I watched from a distance, invisible but not blind. Years later, at a Christmas gathering, she told a neighbor I'd gone off to chase something or other. She always had a head full of ideas. That was her version of love: distance, dismissal, and sugar-coated insults wrapped in passive aggression. But here's the thing: sometimes, being the ghost daughter has its perks. You get to haunt the places they never expected you to go. You get to move in silence. You get to build something they can't see coming. I didn't know it yet, but the version of me she ignored, the one who left with nothing, would become the woman who eventually made her pay attention. Not with a scream, not with a breakdown, but with one sentence. Delivered years later, at a dinner she thought she was hosting in my honor, and that sentence would leave her, and the rest of the room, completely speechless. Because ghosts don't stay quiet forever, not when they learn how to build empires in the dark. They say you marry your mother in a different form. And maybe I never believed that nonsense until I woke up one morning next to Tony, looked at the way he chewed cereal with his mouth open, and realized with a kind of sickening clarity that I had, in fact, married the male version of Diane. Not in looks, not in mannerisms, but in something much deeper and more corrosive. That sense of quiet entitlement, that casual assumption that the world, and by extension I, owed him something for simply existing with charm and half a plan. It's a funny thing how you can grow up swearing you'll never be like your mother, only to end up repeating her mistakes in slow motion, as if fate had a sense of irony and just enough cruelty to let you think it was your own idea. I met Tony when I was 29, freshly out of a long-term relationship with a man who was kind and stable and boring in all the ways I'd convinced myself I didn't need. Tony was the opposite of boring. He walked into a gallery opening with his shirt half unbuttoned, a smirk that practically shouted trouble, and a voice so smooth it made you forget to ask real questions. He noticed me from across the room, or maybe he noticed I was alone, sipping a glass of cheap white wine and trying not to look like I regretted being there. And within 15 minutes, he had made me laugh 3 times, told me he used to be a musician but now consulted for small businesses, and made me feel like the most interesting woman in a room full of curated, exhausting people. Of course, what I didn't know then was that consulting meant bouncing between friends' startups, offering vague advice, and living off favors, charm, and other people's generosity. I also didn't know that the guitar in his apartment was mostly for show, that his ex still paid half his rent out of some mix of guilt and unresolved attachment, or that he would come to treat my ambitions not as admirable, but as mildly inconvenient. Diane loved him instantly. The first time I brought him to dinner, she barely looked at me. She poured him her best wine, asked about his projects, laughed too loud at his mediocre jokes, and told him in front of me that he had a natural ease that reminded her of Zach. I should have left then, not because of the wine or the jokes or the fact that he took her compliment as his due, but because I saw in that moment how happy it made her to see me next to someone who she felt could manage me, contain me even. To Diane, love was only valid if it came with control. Tony proposed after 10 months in a restaurant that was too expensive for his wallet, but comfortably in my mother's range. And of course, that she paid for the engagement dinner without blinking, handed him a congratulatory envelope with what I would later find out was a down payment for our future condo. I didn't ask for it. He did, behind my back. We moved into a place that looked like a magazine photo and felt like a waiting room, all beige and metal and void of soul. And within the first year, Tony had cycled through 3 ventures, each one more vague than the last. I worked, not in the field I studied, but at a corporate events company, planning rich people's weddings and pretending not to mind when they asked for tasteful but extravagant, which is rich person code for make it look humble while spending 6 figures. Tony told his friends I enjoyed making things pretty, as if I was some kind of overpaid florist. And then in year 2, I started baking. Not for money, not yet, just for myself. Early mornings, before emails and Tony's groaning about his next big idea. I'd tie up my hair, put on music, not romantic French stuff, but loud, messy music with bass and mistakes, and bake scones, croissants, pies that cracked unevenly, bread that rose beautifully or failed gloriously. It was the only time I didn't feel like I was pretending. Tony didn't notice. Diane certainly didn't. Zach was too busy driving his new convertible, courtesy of another generous loan from Mom. But slowly, I started bringing pastries to work. People raved. Someone suggested I do a weekend pop-up. I laughed it off, but I didn't forget. Then came the moment that tilted everything. I found an email. It wasn't hidden well, just a forwarded chain from Diane to Tony with the subject line, "Need any help this month?" Inside, she had wired him another $5,000. The note below read, "Don't tell Lauren, she worries." That phrase, "she worries," snapped something in me. It was so casual, so familiar. Diane had spent years gaslighting me into thinking my concerns were overreactions, that I worried too much, that I needed to be more trusting, more soft, more manageable. And here she was funding my husband behind my back, as if I was some fragile idiot who couldn't handle the truth. I didn't confront them immediately. No, that's what old me would have done. Cry, fight, demand an apology that would never come. Instead, I played dumb. I started saving. I asked questions about Tony's projects, with just enough fake curiosity to keep him relaxed. I visited farmers markets, talked to bakers, learned about rent prices, licensing, small business grants, and I kept baking. One night, while Tony snored beside me and the streetlight cut a diagonal line across our bedroom wall, I sat up and whispered into the dark, "I'm getting out. Not just from the marriage, from all of it, the house, the money, the quiet resentment, the web of debts and control. I didn't want to be part of Diane's portfolio anymore. I wanted to be something she hadn't invested in, something she couldn't take credit for. I didn't know it yet, but those first batches of scones, baked at dawn when no one was watching, were the seeds of something much bigger, something that would grow in the shadows, fed by every insult, every manipulation, every moment they thought I wasn't paying attention. Because I was paying attention, and soon they'd find out just how much. By the time I quietly moved out of the condo I had once believed would be the start of something permanent, the silence between Tony and me had stretched so far and thin that it no longer even registered as tension. It had become a kind of ambient noise, a dull hum in the background of our days that we both learned to live with, like a faucet that wouldn't stop dripping or a fridge that ran just a little too loud. There wasn't a single explosive fight or dramatic betrayal that marked the end, just the slow erosion of trust, like sand wearing away the shape of a stone. I packed up my things in the early morning while he slept off another late night of networking, and I left a note on the kitchen counter that simply said, "You can keep the furniture. I want nothing that came from her." And I meant it. Every couch, every vase, every appliance in that sterile place had her fingerprints on it, bought with her money, her taste, her strings attached. I moved into a tiny, windowless back room above an old bookstore owned by a man named Glenn, who didn't care about my past, my family, or the way I hesitated when he asked for a background check. He gave me a key, told me the rent would be low if I agreed to watch the front desk twice a week, and left me alone, which, at that point in my life, felt more like love than anything I'd known. The room smelled like dust and forgotten stories, but it had a small kitchenette, a crooked sink, and a strange peace I hadn't felt in years. I bought a second-hand mixer with my last paycheck, set up a baking station using stacked crates and an old metal table, and began experimenting again. Not just with ingredients, but with the idea that maybe I could live on my own terms. I didn't tell anyone, not Diane, not Zach, and certainly not Tony. Let them think I had moved back in with a friend or left the state entirely. The silence became my shelter. I worked early mornings in the bookstore, baked all afternoon, and spent evenings walking unfamiliar streets just to remember that I still existed outside of their expectations. I created a small Instagram page under the name June's Daughter, a nod to my grandmother, the only woman in my family who had ever loved me without conditions, and started posting photos of my bakes. Imperfect, messy, golden, full of soul. At first it was just a hobby, a way to feel connected to something real. But within weeks, the page started gaining traction. People messaged asking if they could order. Then someone asked if I'd be willing to do a pop-up at a local coffee shop. I said yes, even though the idea terrified me. That first Saturday, I baked from midnight to sunrise, filling the air with sugar and butter and nervous hope. I walked the boxes of pastries 2 blocks to the cafe, set up a small table by the window, and waited. I sold out in 2 hours. The cafe owner asked if I could come back next weekend. I didn't even hesitate. I said yes with that same quiet conviction I'd felt when I told Diane I'd go to Emerson with or without her help. Word spread faster than I could have imagined. Within 3 months, I had a schedule of regular pop-ups, a list of customers who placed pre-orders weekly, and an inbox full of local businesses asking if I catered. I still lived in the tiny back room, still walked to the bookstore every morning, still cleaned up after the mice in the alley, but something had shifted. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't asking for approval. I wasn't waiting for permission. I was building something, brick by invisible brick, that belonged entirely to me. And yet, even as I carved out this new life, Diane and Zach remained shadows at the edge of my progress. Occasionally, I'd get a text from Diane, usually something passive-aggressive masked as concern. "Haven't heard from you. Hope you're doing okay." Or, "Zach mentioned he saw you on the street last week. You looked thin. Are you eating enough?" I never responded. I let the silence grow roots. Then one evening, about 6 months into my new routine, I got a message from an unknown number. It was a screenshot, a photo of my pastries on the Instagram Explore page, with a caption that read, "This woman's croissants are better than any bakery in the city." Beneath it, a comment, "Is this Lauren? Looks like her." The sender had added one line, "Didn't know you were famous now." No name, no signature, but I knew. Diane had found me. Or rather, someone had found me for her. I didn't panic. I didn't call to explain. I didn't run. I simply turned off my phone, wiped my hands on my apron, and went back to finishing a batch of cinnamon rolls for a Sunday brunch order. Because it was in that moment, quiet, calm, covered in flour, that I realized something deeply satisfying. She could see me now, but she couldn't touch me. Zach, on the other hand, wasn't so easy to ignore. One afternoon, he showed up at the bookstore, wearing sunglasses indoors, and that same self-assured smirk he'd had since he was a teenager. "Heard you've been playing Martha Stewart," he said, poking around like he owned the place. "Mom's been worried." I didn't say anything, just stood behind the counter and waited. "Look," he continued, "she's updating her will, okay? I figured maybe you'd want to smooth things over, show up for dinner, be a daughter for once." There it was, the game, the bait, the illusion of inclusion dangled like a carrot. I looked him dead in the eye and said, "Tell her I'll come, but I'm not coming empty-handed." He raised an eyebrow, amused. "Oh yeah? What are you bringing?" I smiled. The truth. And just like that, the chessboard was set. They thought I was still playing checkers, but I had learned the rules of their game, and I had no intention of losing. The day of the dinner unfolded with a strange calmness, the kind that wraps around you, not as comfort, but as a warning, like the eerie stillness before a storm finally collapses onto a town that had spent all summer pretending the clouds meant nothing. I woke early that morning, not because of nerves or anticipation, but because my body had become used to the rhythm of work, of rising before the sun to create something beautiful and temporary. Pastries that would be devoured in moments, but remembered for their warmth, their bite, their imperfection. That morning, I baked only one thing, a lemon olive oil cake with rosemary. Understated but rich, slightly bitter at the end, like memory or regret, or a childhood spent trying to earn a smile from someone who never learned how to give them without strings attached. I dressed simply, No designer labels, no red lipstick, no attempt to play a role in the theater Diane had directed for decades. I wore a long navy dress, flat shoes, and a small gold chain I had inherited from my grandmother, the only woman whose voice didn't echo with judgment when I thought of family. I didn't bring a gift. I didn't bring a bottle of wine. I brought only the cake, tucked carefully into a plain white box, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you no longer need to beg for a seat at a table that was built to humiliate you. The house was exactly as I remembered, pristine, sterile, and aching with the kind of wealth that mistakes coldness for sophistication. The lawn had been freshly trimmed, the hedges sculpted, the marble foyer polished to the point of mockery. Zach greeted me at the door with a grin that was half smirk, half surprise, like he hadn't really expected me to show, and certainly not looking like I hadn't spent the last year crumbling in some tragic heap without their approval. "You clean up nice," he said, stepping aside to let me in, his voice heavy with sarcasm and stale cologne. I didn't bother responding. Some people grow, others just calcify. Inside, the usual suspects had gathered. A few distant cousins whose names I could never remember. A couple of Diane's bridge club friends with voices like rusted bells. And a scattering of people who had long since learned that attending her events was less about enjoyment and more about proving they were still loyal to the dynasty she imagined herself matriarch of. Diane stood in the living room, surrounded by the usual chorus of carefully curated admiration, sipping from a crystal flute with that carefully neutral expression she wore whenever she was preparing for a performance. When she saw me, her smile flickered for a moment, not out of joy but calculation, like a poker player surprised by a card they hadn't expected but were determined to make work in their favor. "Lauren," she said, gliding toward me with arms outstretched and voice too high, too bright. "I wasn't sure you'd make it." "I said I would," I replied, handing her the box. "Brought dessert." She took the box as though it were a bomb and nodded slowly, then leaned in and whispered, "Let's not make this about the past, I didn't answer, and she didn't wait for one. Dinner was served in the formal dining room, with the good china and the stiff napkins, and the kind of silence that only happens when everyone is too afraid to be the first to speak. Diane sat at the head of the table, flanked by Zach on her right and an empty seat to her left, which I assumed had been left for me on purpose. A symbolic gesture, a reminder of my place if I dared forget. The meal itself was a blur of forced small talk, clinking silverware, and occasional questions lobbed in my direction like grenades disguised as pleasantries. "Still baking, Lauren? I saw your Instagram. Very quaint. Do you do birthday cakes too?" I nodded, smiled, sipped my water, let them laugh. Let them think I was smaller than I had become. Let them get comfortable. It wasn't until the plates were cleared and the servers, yes, she'd hired servers, began bringing out dessert that Diane stood, tapping her glass with the side of her knife, in that signature move of hers that meant something was coming. Something orchestrated and deliberate and designed to draw blood without spilling a drop. "I'd like to say a few words," she began, and all conversation ceased. "First, thank you all for coming to celebrate Lauren's birthday. She's had quite a journey this past year, and I think we can all agree she looks better than ever." A few polite laughs, mostly from people who weren't paying attention. "I've always believed in being transparent," she continued, tone shifting into something more formal, more performative, especially when it comes to matters of family and legacy. "So I wanted to share that I've recently updated my estate plans." At that, the room shifted. Forks paused midair. Zach leaned forward just slightly. My pulse didn't quicken. It slowed. "I've made the decision," she said, "to pass the majority of the estate to Zach, who has remained close, consistent, and involved over the years." No one spoke. Not yet. "I know this may come as a surprise to some of you," she added, looking directly at me now, her eyes sharp beneath the mask of civility. "But choices have consequences. Distance has consequences." Still, I said nothing, let her finish. "I do this not out of spite, but clarity. Lauren has chosen a different path, and I respect that. but this family, this home, will be entrusted to those who have stood by it. She raised her glass. To family. And then finally I stood. For a moment, every eye turned to me, some with curiosity, others with discomfort, and a few, like Zach's, with barely concealed glee. He thought I would crumble. He thought I'd beg. He didn't know I'd spent the last year building something stronger than their approval. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. Instead, I looked at Diane, squarely, and said, "It's okay." A pause. Confusion. I let it sit, then added, "The real inheritance wasn't the money or the house or your approval." I looked around the room now, making sure they were all listening. "The real inheritance was the business I built without you, the life I made without needing your permission." Silence. "And funny enough," I added, stepping back from the table, "I think I'm finally proud of the woman you tried not to raise." I turned, walked out, never looked back. And behind me, the silence didn't just fall. It shattered. It's a strange thing, the way people look at you once you've stopped playing the part they wrote for you. As if the refusal to follow the script is a betrayal greater than any lie, any theft, any real damage done. The morning after that dinner, after I left Diane standing speechless in the middle of her own kingdom, I woke up not with regret, not with anxiety, but with the stillness of someone who had finally removed a splinter that had been buried so deep for so long it had begun to feel like part of the bone. I brewed a pot of coffee in the tiny kitchen of the walk-up I now rented above my own flagship bakery, a space with scuffed floors, peeling paint, and more soul than that whitewashed tomb of a mansion could ever dream of. And as the scent of roasted beans filled the air, I sat by the window, watching the city wake up, and felt something I hadn't let myself believe in for years: peace without permission. The fallout, as I had predicted, was swift and ugly. Diane didn't call, of course not, but I received a flurry of messages from Zach, each one more agitated and passive-aggressive than the last. The first was short and condescending. "You really embarrassed her." The second, a little sharper. "She's reconsidering the will, you know. You could have played this smarter." And the third, dripping with that wounded entitlement I had come to recognize as his birthright. "You think you're better than us now?" I didn't respond to any of them. I didn't need to, because while they were busy playing the politics of perception, I was working, building, expanding. In the months that followed, my bakery, once a whisper of a dream cobbled together with late-night baking and Craigslist mixers, exploded into something undeniable. The exposure from the pop-ups had grown into a cult following, and after that dinner, someone had secretly recorded my real inheritance speech and uploaded it to social media, where it went viral not because I was eloquent or dramatic, but because I had said out loud what so many daughters, so many invisible women, so many underestimated souls had wanted to scream for years: that freedom is a gift you give yourself. And sometimes the greatest revenge is simply refusing to stay small. Orders poured in, journalists called, investors reached out. But the message that changed everything came on a rainy Tuesday morning when I received a letter, not an email, not a text, an actual handwritten letter from Aunt Marcia, Diane's long-estranged sister, a woman I hadn't seen since I was 9 years old, and who had been exiled from the family for reasons no one ever clearly explained. Inside the envelope was a note, written in looping, elegant script, that read, "I saw what you did. Your grandmother would have been proud. I'd like to meet." We met at a quiet cafe 2 towns over, away from the eyes and whispers of Diane's orbit. Marcia looked nothing like my mother, and yet everything like what my mother could have been if she had chosen kindness over control. She told me stories I had never heard, about Diane's early insecurities, about the way she clung to success like armor, about the choices that turned her into someone who believed power mattered more than connection. And then she handed me a folder. Inside were documents, property titles, investment records, a business account registered under a quiet LLC. Years ago, Marcia had sold off a few small properties and used the capital to fund a series of anonymous investments. One of those investments, she revealed, had been in a small but promising bakery startup with a woman she admired from a distance, June's daughter. She had no idea it was me until the video. "I believed in what you were doing," she said. "I just didn't know it was family." That folder changed everything. Not because of the money. I had already learned how to survive and thrive without other people's cash, but because it meant that somewhere along the way, someone had believed in me without needing to control me, without needing a favor in return, without needing to be worshipped for their help. It made the next step clear. I used the funds to open 2 more locations. I bought my supplier a delivery van. I hired 3 single moms at full salary and benefits. I created something that felt like community, like resistance, like reclamation. And then, almost as an afterthought, I did something that wasn't necessary, but felt poetic. I bought a strip of retail property on the edge of town, the same space where Diane had once opened her first real estate office, the building she had lost during a recession and spent years pretending never existed. I bought it, quietly, through an LLC, and I let her rent it, at full market price. When the lease renewal came up, I requested a meeting. She didn't know it was me. The paperwork had been clean, the names faceless, but I showed up alone, with a copy of the lease in hand and a look she couldn't quite read. She stared at me, confused, then offended, then suddenly, as the weight of it landed, stunned. "You?" she said, barely able to hide the tremor in her voice. I nodded. "Me." "You bought this building?" "I built the company that bought it," I said, voice calm, steady. "You're welcome to stay, but the rent will increase." She opened her mouth to argue, but I cut her off with the same tone she had used on me so many times before. "This isn't personal, it's business. Choices have consequences." I didn't stay to hear her reply. I didn't need to, because by then I had finally realized that I didn't owe her anything. Not an explanation, not forgiveness, not even my presence. The last thing she saw, as I walked out of the office that used to be hers and was now mine, was a daughter who had stopped asking to be loved and started choosing to be free. Some might say I went too far. Others might say I didn't go far enough. But I didn't destroy her. I didn't burn down her world. I just outgrew it. Slowly, deliberately, without apology. And that, I think, was the one outcome she never prepared for, because she had spent her whole life building puppets, and I had quietly built an empire.